It was a freezing evening, the kind where the wind cuts right through your coat, no matter how thick it is. James hurried down the sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. He had just finished a long shift at work, his stomach growling, his mind already set on grabbing something warm to eat before heading home. As he neared the corner diner, his eyes landed on a figure sitting on the sidewalk, a woman bundled in layers of worn-out clothes, her head bowed, arms wrapped tightly around herself for warmth. James had passed by countless homeless people before. Like most people in the city, he had always felt bad, but never really stopped. Tonight was different. There was something about her. Maybe the way she stared at the diner's window, watching people enjoy their meals with quiet longing. Or maybe it was just the weight of his own conscience pressing down on him. Without overthinking, he turned and stepped into the diner. The warmth hit him instantly, along with the rich aroma of coffee and fresh food. He walked up to the counter, ordered his usual meal, then paused before adding one more. "Make it to go," he said, glancing outside. Minutes later, he walked out, approached the woman, and carefully held out the bag. "Here," he said gently. She looked up, her eyes filled with both surprise and hesitation. "For me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Yeah, it's warm. Hope it helps." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether to accept. Then, with a trembling hand, she took the bag. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with something James couldn't quite place. Gratitude maybe, or something deeper. He gave her a small nod before heading home, never expecting to see her again. But he was wrong. The following week, James had almost forgotten about the encounter. Life had moved on, work kept him busy, and that cold night outside the diner was just another moment in the past, until the knock came. It was late, almost 9 p.m., and James wasn't expecting anyone. He hesitated before opening the door, and when he did, his breath caught in his throat. There she was, the same woman, but something was different this time. She wasn't sitting on a sidewalk, shivering in the cold. She stood upright, her face cleaner, her hair brushed, and in her hands, she held something wrapped in old newspaper, as if it were precious. James blinked, caught off guard. How did you? She offered a small, hesitant smile. "I had to find you," she said, her voice steadier than before. "I have something for you." James could only stare, questions spinning in his head. He had bought her one meal, one simple act of kindness, and yet here she was, standing at his doorstep, holding a gift. What could it possibly be? And why did he feel like this was just the beginning of something much bigger? James stood frozen at the doorway, his mind racing as he looked at the woman. The last time he'd seen her, she had been sitting on the cold sidewalk, clutching a paper bag of food. Now, she was standing in front of him, looking different, still tired, still carrying the weight of something unspoken, but steadier, more present. And she was holding a gift. He swallowed, trying to find the right words. You didn't have to do this." A small smile touched her lips, but her eyes held something deeper, something unspoken. "I know," she said softly. "But I wanted to." James hesitated before stepping aside. "Do you want to come in?" She seemed unsure. For a second, then nodded. He moved aside as she stepped in cautiously, as if afraid of taking up too much space. The warmth of the apartment wrapped around her, so different from the biting cold outside. James gestured toward the small couch. "Sit," he said. "I'll get us some tea." As he moved toward the kitchen, his mind raced. Who was she? What had happened to her? And why did she go out of her way to find him? When he returned, she was still holding the wrapped package in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges. She looked up as he handed her a steaming cup. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer this time. James sat across from her, curiosity eating at him. "I never got your name." She exhaled a small breath, as if she hadn't spoken it in a long time. "Emily." James nodded. "Nice to meet you, Emily." She looked down at the package, then back up at him. "I know this probably seems strange," she admitted. "But ever since that night, I haven't stopped thinking about what you did for me." James shifted slightly. "It was just a meal," he said, not wanting any praise for something that had felt like basic human decency. Emily shook her head. "No, it was more than that." She hesitated before continuing. "That night, I was at my lowest. I hadn't eaten in days. I was cold, and I didn't think I could go on much longer. I was starting to believe I didn't matter to the world anymore." She paused, gripping the package tighter. "And then you showed up." James felt a strange tightness in his chest. He had never considered the deeper impact of that moment. "I told myself that if a stranger could care enough to help me, maybe I could find a way to help myself." Her voice trembled slightly. "I spent the next few days going to the shelter. They helped me get cleaned up, gave me a place to sleep, and I started thinking, maybe there was still hope for me." James was silent, taking it all in. "I don't have much," Emily continued, "but I wanted to give you something, to thank you." She carefully placed the package on the table in front of him. "Please, open it." James hesitated, then slowly reached for the package. The newspaper wrapping crinkled as he peeled it away, revealing a small wooden box. It looked old, but polished, as if someone had taken great care of it. He lifted the lid, and his breath caught. Inside, there was a delicate silver chain with a small pendant. It wasn't expensive, but it was beautiful, and beneath it, tucked carefully in the box, was a folded note. He looked up, eyes questioning. Emily's fingers twisted together in her lap. "That necklace. It belonged to my mother." Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "Before she passed, she told me to hold on to it. That one day I'd find someone who reminded me of the kindness she always believed in." She met his gaze, eyes glistening. "That person was you." James felt something shift inside him. Something he couldn't quite put into words. He had given a stranger a meal, expecting nothing in return. But in doing so, he had unknowingly given her something far more important: hope. The room fell into silence, heavy with emotion. James ran his fingers over the pendant, struggling to find the right thing to say. But before he could, there was a knock at the door, a sharp, urgent knock. James and Emily exchanged a glance, tension creeping into the air. James set the box down and moved toward the door, a strange unease settling over him. When he opened it, he wasn't sure what he expected, but it certainly wasn't what he saw. A man stood there, his face shadowed by the dim hallway light. His eyes flickered toward Emily, and something in his expression darkened. "There you are," the man muttered. Emily's face paled. She gripped the couch armrest, as if bracing herself. James felt his pulse quicken. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice careful but firm. The man's gaze remained locked on Emily. "She didn't tell you," he said with a cold smirk. "She's been running, and I finally found her." James felt the weight of the moment settle, like a stone in his chest. Something was very, very wrong. James could feel the tension thick in the air, his heart pounding, as he glanced between Emily and the man at the door. There was something about him, something off. His smirk was too confident, his posture too casual, as if he knew Emily had nowhere to run. James stepped forward, subtly placing himself between them. "Who are you?" he asked again, firmer this time. The man let out a low chuckle. "I think the better question is, who is she really?" His eyes flickered to Emily, challenging her to speak. James turned to her, searching her face. Her hands were clenched, her shoulders tense, but it wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was something deeper, something personal. Emily took a shaky breath. "His name is Mark," she finally said. "I used to know him." Mark scoffed. "No, me? That's a cute way to put it." His expression darkened. "You disappeared, Emily. And you took something that wasn't yours." James caught the slight tremor in Emily's hands. He had no idea what Mark was talking about, but he could see the way Emily was holding her breath, as if waiting for something to explode. "She doesn't owe you anything," James said firmly. Mark tilted his head, his smirk twitching. "That's rich, coming from someone who just met her." James felt his grip tighten on the door, his instincts on high alert. "You should leave." For a moment, Mark didn't move. His eyes flickered between them, calculating, as if deciding whether it was worth pushing further. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he exhaled sharply. "You got lucky this time," he muttered to Emily. "But this isn't over." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. James didn't move until he heard the distant sound of the building's front door shutting. Then, he turned back to Emily. She let out a breath she had clearly been holding, her shoulders sagging. "Are you okay?" James asked, his voice softer now. Emily nodded, but she was visibly shaken. I didn't think he'd find me," she admitted. James sat down across from her, waiting. He wasn't going to push, but he could tell there was more to this story. Emily swallowed hard. "Before I ended up on the streets, I was working at a small shop. It wasn't much, but it was honest work." She hesitated. "Mark was involved with the wrong people. He got me caught up in things I didn't understand. At the time," she let out a shaky breath. "When I realized how bad it was, I left. I ran, but I had nothing. Nowhere to go. I ended up losing everything." James listened, letting the words sink in. "I thought he'd forgotten about me," she said, "but I guess I was wrong." James glanced toward the door, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to deal with him alone." Emily looked up, something shifting in her expression. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked softly. James thought about it for a moment. He had never considered himself a hero, just an ordinary guy who had done one small thing for a stranger. But now, that small thing had turned into something bigger, something that mattered. "Because sometimes people just need a little kindness," he said simply. Emily let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "I don't know how to repay you for everything." James shook his head. "You already have." He glanced at the small wooden box sitting on the table between them. "This means more than you know." Emily gave him a grateful smile, her eyes glistening. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, James realized that one small act of kindness had changed not just her life, but his own. Outside, the city lights flickered, life continuing as usual. But inside that small apartment, something had shifted. Two strangers, once worlds apart, had found an unexpected connection. And in a world that often felt too cold, too distant, that connection was everything.